Yep, you're live.
Welcome to our, it says now we're live. Welcome to our final, it's not really summer anymore, but our final Summer of Evolution book club discussion. So it's the end of September. We're going to pretend like it's summer, which sounds nice to me. And I'm really excited. We postponed this discussion from August, and I'm really excited that we found a time for people to get together and discuss this, because I really liked this book. So the book is Improbable Destinies, Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution. And I'm going to say that this was like one of my favorite covers. I would just have it out around my house and I'd be like, I like that cover. It's so colorful. It's so great. So points on the cover already. But it is an excellent book, and I'm really excited for the chance to discuss it with folks. Before I get into the book, I'm just going to do introductions, and I'll ask the people who are here to introduce themselves. My name is Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. I have a PhD in microbiology, except I did not get a lot of microbial ecology or general ecology training in my PhD. And one of the things that I've been doing in my research program, but also as somebody who teaches undergraduates, is to think more about microbial ecology and ecology and evolution more broadly. And I think this was an excellent book for thinking about some of these ideas. So I'm very glad to have read it. And next to me is Sunita. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Sunita. I have a PhD in mathematical biology, but I'm doing epidemiology now. And I work at Imperial College in mathematical epidemiology. I really love this book, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's thoughts on the book.
All right, thank you. And then next to her is Mike. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? I'm Mike Davis, and I'm a PhD student, fourth-year PhD student at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. So it's kind of like summer still down here. I'm working on a PhD in microbial ecology. My focus is on the bacterial communities in wastewater treatment plants and antibiotic resistance genes that we find there, and factors relating to the community ecology and how those factors affect the presence and the passage of the resistance genes through the system and then out through the effluent, which often happens. So I also am a teaching assistant for a undergraduate research-based freshman biology lab where we use ciliates tetrahymena as a model organism. And there's tons of ciliates in wastewater. So I'm trying to get those into my research somehow, because their vacuoles can be micro niches for horizontal gene transfer and stuff. But yeah, I guess that's it.
All right, thank you, Mike. And then next to Mike is Luke. Luke, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Luke Spooner. I go to the University of Northern British Columbia. I'm a master's student. I'm working on with the mountain pine beetle. I'm trying to functionally characterize 2 of its oxidative stress proteins. And I also quite enjoyed the book, and I also really like the cover.
Lots of votes for the cover. The cover is popular. And I think Bryan there's someone else who's trying to join us. It's his first time, so we might be running into some technical problems. But he did send me some thoughts on it, so I'll do my best to kind of look over those. If he isn't able to connect with us here, I'll see if I could kind of bring that in as we're talking. Okay, so the framework of this book is about trying to understand the trajectory of evolution and kind of asking how repeatable is evolution. So the title, or the subtitle, if you will, Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution, kind of gets at this idea of is evolution repeatable, and then can we predict where evolution is going based on what we know about a situation? So the book kind of sets this up as 2 competing worldviews about evolution. And I'm just going to read a short paragraph from the bottom of page 22, because I think that that kind of captures the thesis of the book relatively well. So it says, "This book is about the extent to which life repeats itself, the result of species evolving similar adaptations in response to similar environmental circumstances. More loftily stated, it is about determinism, whether natural selection inevitably produces the same evolutionary outcomes, or whether the particular events a lineage experiences, the contingencies of history, affect the end result." So the idea here is that he sets up kind of these two competing notions and the representatives that he uses to kind of argue for them are Simon Conway Morris and Stephen Jay Gould. And he references back to Wonderful Life, the book by Stephen Jay Gould, which someone had suggested for this book club, and is one that's now definitely on my to-read list, especially given how heavily it was referenced here. And he kind of sets this up as saying, so Stephen Jay Gould argued for the idea that evolution is not repeatable, that if you rewound the tape of life, all of the events that occurred for over 2.5 billion years had to do with little changes happening, little jots here, so forth, that kind of set off a chain of events that went in a particular direction. But if you backed up again and restarted, you wouldn't see that path produced again. So A goes to B, B goes to C, C goes to D, and the ultimate pathway of A to D would not look the same if you backed up and started back again. And he contrasts that with Simon Conway Morris and the idea that evolution is repeatable. The evidence for this comes from observations of convergence in evolution. And the reason it's repeatable is because the selective pressures or the selective constraints of particular ecosystems or environments is such that there are only a few solutions for solving your problem as an evolving species. So there's only a few solutions for dealing with increasing temperatures, or there's only a few solutions for dealing with increasing drought. And then you're going to see the same adaptations because there are constraints on what evolution is going to be able to do given its material it's working with. So you could see repeated evolution, you could predict evolution because of that. That's kind of what I came away with of kind of the general framework of the book. Did you guys have other thoughts on that, or maybe thoughts on the setup of these two contrasting views? Do you think it's a good idea to kind of set these up as kind of competing hypotheses?
I'll say something.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Go.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Now, am I unmuted now? Sorry, I was hitting my mute button too many times. Yeah, I think it's, especially, I didn't realize how influential that book. I read Wonderful Life, I don't know, very late 90s, 97, 98, around there. But he mentioned somewhere that it's been cited in like 4,000 other books and journal articles and so on. And I think it is good, since he's set up such a strong argument there for that idea, that to contrast Conway Morris's idea. But I think it's hard, because when you just setting up the problem sort of simply like that, when you say evolution, you're kind of thinking of the whole thing from the beginning of life until now. And really, when you look at it, I mean, all these examples of convergence is really, not as smaller timescales than that. So I think it's important to really kind of focus the question on the scale. Are we talking about the history of life until now, and what would we see? Would we see things like us, or are we talking about smaller scale events like the island biogeography and everything? So I think he kind of gets at that at the end. He kind of says it's kind of a both. That's how I read his conclusions, that both really take place. But I really think it depends on the scale of your questioning.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sunita, you were also gonna jump in.
I was just agreeing with you, Laura, that I think it's a really good setup. Really, just from the perspective of the way it's written, I think it was a very good setup. I'm sure that Gould was not the only person to think about this idea. I'm sure there would have been other scientists, but instead of doing a literature review, we just crystallized the problem into two very clear questions and very clear from two scientists. And for me, that worked really well. I think it was a very good setup. So I really like that way of thinking about it.
And I think that's especially useful if you want this to be a book accessible to the public.
Sure, yeah.
So for people who are not familiar with all of this and wouldn't, maybe as I hadn't read Wonderful Life, you're kind of introducing them to two ideas that they could kind of latch onto. Mm-hmm. So when he calls back to them throughout the rest of the book, it's a little bit easier. It's a good memory tool for anybody who's reading this as a member of the lay public.
Yep, definitely.
Luke, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, just on that last point that you said, I think this book does do a really good job of making evolution accessible to people who might not necessarily be immersed in it as much as we are. And I thought that the language that he used was really not to overuse accessible, but was accessible. And yeah, the premise of it, these two major factors that influence evolution, I think it was a good way to kind of dovetail them together in a way that, I don't know, you get a nice kind of global perspective of the theory of evolution.
Yeah, and I was especially impressed given that, and I'm not going to list all of the examples. There are quite a few really excellently described examples. I think all the descriptions are really accessible, but it ranges. It's not, here in my department, and I'm sure in other departments too, there's a tendency to kind of split biology into big bio and little bio. So you're big bio if you work with like salamanders, and you're little bio if you work with cells. And one of the things I really enjoyed about this book is it just blew apart those divisions and kind of spans the whole, and it didn't say like, well, in the little world, here's what's happening. It just kind of went from, here's lizards, here's finches, here's things that we've seen with other big organisms. Here we're going to talk about microbes. And look, the same kinds of things are happening across all these systems. And I appreciate that it was really wide-ranging in the types of examples that he was pulling in to talk about this. Excuse me, before we get too far into talking about examples, I did want to bring up one point that was constantly occurring to me, and Bryan, what Bryan sent to me, also brings this up. And it's the idea of the definition of convergence that's used in the book. And I felt, and I'm curious if anybody else encountered this, I kind of thought that the definition of convergence was a little fuzzy. Like what we were using as examples of convergence kind of shifted a little bit. And I don't know that I was completely satisfied with what we were going to count as convergence and what we were going to say is not necessarily convergence, even though it looks like it is. And he even addresses this at a certain point in the book, and I can't remember exactly where, but he does point out, some of this is very broad. Like if you're thinking about adaptations for flight, are you going to lump in bats and birds and, the flying squirrel kind of thing? Are you going to put all of these things together as being evidence of convergence? Or are you going to draw distinctions that with bats, we've got leathery skin, and with birds, we've got feathers, and you've got different ways that the skeletal structure has evolved. So he himself discusses it in the book. But I feel like maybe convergence was a little bit fuzzy as the way it was being presented. Did you guys run across that? Was that something that occurred to you guys when you were, when you were reading it, what were you thinking about the way convergence was being defined?
Okay, I'll jump in first again.
Yeah, go for it.
Get my comments out of the way. Yeah, I was flipping through it on page 90 and 91 when he is talking about the evolution of flight. He does mention at the bottom of 91 where one draws line between convergence and non-convergence is somewhat arbitrary, he says. And I think he's getting at exactly what you say. And then I don't know that he mentions it that much again until towards the end of the book. He mentions it again. He may have mentioned it elsewhere. I forgot, but so he did. But I think you're right. He says that it's kind of arbitrary at that point. But then later on, he just mentions convergence or not convergence. And again, I think it's looking at the scale of your question. Are you talking about the overall, it's an airfoil, or are you talking about the convergence of the muscles and the covering, and like you said, birds versus bats and all that. So I think it would have been nicer if he had just maybe brought us back to that point a couple more times as he's going through the book, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I see really quickly, I see Nicole has just jumped in. Hi, Nicole. Do you want to?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me right now, or is this not working?
We can hear you. Yeah. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, because you've got a new position? So
definitely. So my name is Nicole Suttio, formerly from the University of Northern British Columbia, where Luke is at currently. But now I'm in Montreal, Canada, working in the R&D department of Concentric Agriculture Incorporated, a company that makes microbial inoculants. So that's the microbiological connection still.
Very, very recently moved, within the last month
recently. Almost 2 months I've been here. It was August 1st. So it's really good to see all of you again.
Yeah, I'm really glad you could join us. I'm glad it worked out.
Yes.
So we were just kind of talking about the framework of the book, of the idea of evolution not being repeatable versus examples of convergence suggesting that evolution is repeatable. Mike had some thoughts about, are we defining convergence in a consistent way? I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in on that before we kind of moved on from that.
I'm just going to say that it's kind of an interesting discussion for me, because with my training, the main example that I was always tossed in biochemical study is convergent evolution of serine protease active sites, which is such a departure from like body plan environment interactions, or body plan how do I deal with living my way in the world. It's just, how am I going to cut this protein? So I think there's a couple different scales for understanding evolutionary landscapes, and it was interesting to kind of read it from this more organismal perspective. But I think there's this one sort of structure functioning kind of question that creeps into both the macroorganism scale and the micro. How do I make this biomolecule that's going to let me do the things I need to do? And it's that idea of every organism is constrained by its current form and its current repertoire. So is that actually what's imposing the walls that makes convergence a thing that's likely to happen? And I don't think we ever get to a clean answer about that in the book. But I mean, I know that some of the discussion actually goes that way, that there's only certain ways that a foot can like become aquatically adapted if you've gone from terrestrial to water or the other way around. So these ideas about like, are these just for a form to take when we talk about shifting what's needed to survive in an environment? They still sit in my mind as thought experiment type things. And I think with Conway Morris, I don't know if that's his full name because I can't remember. I didn't even finish the book. But I mean, it sounds like his assertions about convergence are heavy-handedness, but I think it's hard to know probabilistically what's driving that, in my opinion. It's still an interesting discussion to go to with students, though, when we think about what evolution is supposed to be doing, which is the supposed to is something that we slap on it with our observations anyhow. That is sort of a rambling point, but I think it's just this idea of it's really darn complicated.
Yes, I think those are good points. I am going to really quickly, I want to point, so Bryan, who was interested in discussing the book as well, he might be having some technical difficulties joining us. He did send me some of his written out thoughts, and this is a point that he brought up as well. So I've only just gotten these within the last few minutes, so I'm going to just see if I can kind of make something, but I think he's making a good point here. So Bryan pulled out a quote, and I don't have the page number, but this is a quote from the book to try and define convergence. So it says, "Is convergence a pervasive demonstration of the predictable forces of natural selection toward outcomes predestined by the environment? Or are examples of convergence the exception, cherry-picked illustrations of biological predictability in a haphazard world in which most species have no evolutionary parallel?" So he does come back to this idea in the book of like one-offs or singletons. Towards the end of the book, he actually emphasizes the point that human beings like ourselves are evolutionary one-offs. There is not in any other type of parallel to us on the planet. So we don't have like large birds that we can kind of converse with about books and so forth. So we've only seen one human being species emerge. So that would be a singleton. That would be an example where you can't find convergence. And so Bryan's kind of pointing out that and I think this is underlying some of why I was kind of unsure about how we were defining convergence, is he's making a point that contrasts pattern with mechanism. So are there patterns of convergence versus is the underlying, I think this is what he's saying, is the underlying mechanism showing parallels that then give you the outcome is the same. So he says, he's making some points that there are a lot of mechanisms that are going to be biasing evolutionary outcomes if they're developmental or phylogenetic. So if you kind of lump this into a category of convergence, you're introducing some problems there. And he's also, let me see where I can find this again. So he's pointing out things like wrinkles in this idea, things like phylogenetic constraint. So he's arguing that we kind of need to think about phylogenetic relationships when we're choosing our examples and thinking about how our examples are illustrating different things. So there's in my postdoc is actually when I first learned about this idea, the idea of phylogenetic independence. So if you're going to be drawing conclusions about something being broadly happening, you've got to make sure that you have phylogenetically independent taxa, that you didn't just basically pick a bunch of examples and you can track them all back to one recent common ancestor and go, yeah, but that's because all these guys, basically, it happened here. And so you're going to pick out all these extant taxa and go, look, that's an example of the same thing. It's like, no, it happened back here, and now you're seeing it like this. So the idea being that you need to have phylogenetic independence to be able to make an argument that you've got parallels. Oh, and here's Bryan himself. Oh, good.
I finally got it going here.
I was just trying to kind of go through your thoughts, but you can do it now yourself.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you something about what you just said. So if you go back long enough, then you will find a common ancestor, right? So what do you, like,
right.
What was your...
And admittedly, that was where in my postdoc, because this was something I was discussing with my postdoc advisor, because we were studying bacterial endosymbionts of ants. And so she was arguing for, you need to make sure, if we're going to draw conclusions, we need to have phylogenetically independent taxa. And that was exactly what I said. I was like,
is that related to Felsenstein's phylogenetically independent contrast methods?
I think so. I admittedly
learned a little bit about that, and
yeah, if my postdoc advisor Jen Werner-Green were here, she could give you the best description of this, and we had many conversations, and I still don't feel like I have the best handle on it, but I understood the thrust of what she was saying, especially in the context of our own system. But I think that it always kept in mind for me. When I was reading things about people drawing conclusions and parallels, that was something I was kept in my mind was, okay, how much of this could potentially be explained by it being a derived characteristic versus an ancestral characteristic, so forth. But so Bryan, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, sure, no problem. First off, apologies for the tech hiccups. This is my first round, so I had to download a few plugins. Right. So my name is Bryan Swartz, paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, global ecologist by training. I recently kind of quasi left the R1 lifestyle so I could focus a bit more on teaching and education and outreach, but have recently reestablished my connections up in the Bay Area and working on certain research efforts therein. But beyond that, I mean, my background is the history and future of life and Earth, and that's kind of a lot, but it has focused less on certain microbiological questions and much more so on a lot of the key themes that exist at the crux of this book, which revolve around the history and structure of evolutionary theory, a lot of Steve Gould's classic arguments. I've been through a lot of his works quite a lot with some very wonderful people who have helped to guide me through the thinking and the key talking points. But in short, paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, history structure of evolutionary theory, cuts across a lot of this stuff. So that's why I'm interested in this.
Great, and thank you for joining us.
Of course, thanks for.
I was, so I just, maybe if, I was attempting from what you sent me in your outline to try to perhaps reconstruct your thoughts, because a point that I had raised just a little bit ago, and I think it's a point that you were emphasizing as well, is as I was reading the book, it's the, what's our definition of convergence? We talked a little bit about the fact that even in the book, the author is acknowledging that, you know, what you define as convergence or not convergence is going to dictate how convinced you are about the examples that you're drawing from. You had some thoughts about kind of the definition of convergence. Do you want to quickly kind of, I was getting around what you were saying, but do you want to quickly kind of encapsulate what your thinking was?
Yeah, no worries. So, I mean, historically, in recent years, different authors have attempted to diagnose convergence in different ways. So Dave Jablonski at the University of Chicago came out with a book a few years ago wherein he articulated convergence actually exactly as John is articulating convergence in Improbable Destinies, whereas it's just like any situation where two or more lineages, quote unquote, converge on some combination of traits, convergence. That is, it's a focus on pattern only. Whereas by contrast, Steve Gould, among many classic others, focused less just on emphasizing pattern and went out of their way to really attempt to articulate the underlying mechanisms that explain the patterns that we get. And so when we consider those mechanisms, perhaps as you have all heard in evolutionary circles, there's, and even John Losos gets into this a bit in his book, but there's a difference between what's called parallelism versus convergence. And so those two words are frequently enough used interchangeably, though perhaps they should be separated out. And that is when we're talking about parallelism in the case of like many of the great examples of John's work with anoles and, you know, islands and so forth, we are quite literally talking about shared developmental programs among close relatives that predispose evolutionary outcomes. And so if that's the case, if you're talking about some shared developmental program as a result of recency of shared common ancestry that's predisposing an outcome, then that detracts at least a bit from the external ecological signal coming in via natural selection, whereby you're getting both kind of the internal developmental historical factors and external ecological ones both working together to produce parallel evolutionary outcomes. That's parallelism. Whereas by contrast, convergence, again, convergence articulated as emphasizing mechanism, de-emphasizes the point about shared developmental themes and instead errs more on the side of saying, look, if these are very distant relatives that don't have a shared developmental program, yet they are still, quote unquote, converging on some kind of evolutionary outcome, such as flightless, or not flightless, but flying insects on the one hand, and then say flying birds on the other, different mechanisms, and as far as like producing wings and so on and so forth, at least in some ways. And so if the developmental mechanisms are different, but the outcomes are the same, that would be much more of a triumph of natural selection, external ecological things over the internal developmental historical ones to produce a convergent outcome. So there's been a bit of debate about this in the literature anyway, but the short of it is that when one lumps all cases of similar outcomes in this broad category of convergence and does not distinguish mechanism from pattern, you get into a little bit of squish that could otherwise be dissected in a way that perhaps more appropriately speaks to the history and structure of evolutionary theory. And so just the last little tidbit on this is that John does get into those underlying mechanisms. And he does it a lot. He speaks about non-adaptive convergence in salamanders. So Dave Wake at Berkeley was his PhD advisor. And Dave has done a lot of work on this, wherein, like, you know, in terms of digit loss in salamanders, for example, which is a case of non-adaptive outcomes that arise repeatedly as a result of shared developmental programs that predispose those outcomes. But what that does is if you have a developmental program that's predisposing an outcome, then that takes away from the external action or the external role of selection in explaining these kinds of patterns. And so John does get into this stuff, but again, I just don't think it is as appropriately packaged in a structure of evolutionary theory, given the history of how these ideas have been batted around in the literature for the past few hundred years.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a good explanation. And that's interesting because as you were explaining that point, I was thinking, oh, that's interesting, because I had actually, we were talking about page 90 where he talks about the structure of wings. And he says, you know, and Mike pointed this out earlier too, where you draw the line between convergence and non-convergence among structures that are grossly similar and produce the same functional advantage is arbitrary. And so he says, you know, I consider the wings of birds and bats and pterosaurs to be convergent. And so based on your explanation, that makes sense now to me. Whereas when I first read this, I was like, but are they? Because they're real different if you look at the pictures.
Yeah, and they are so anatomically totally right. But if we are emphasizing, so that is, if we're focusing on mechanism, then the emphasis should really be on function if we're going to consider this tagline called convergence. And so that is the function of wings in birds and bats, like, no doubt they are functionally very similar. But if we're going to then compare, say, the wings of birds and, let's say, insects, not just in terms of function, but in terms of the underlying developmental mechanisms, speaking in terms of a phylogenetic backbone, I know you guys were kind of speaking a moment ago as I was trying to tap in here, in terms of like how deep in terms of a phylogeny or common ancestry do you go. There are certain genes even that go way back that I'm blanking on the regulatory genes that are responsible for producing just like an outgrowth. That outgrowth could eventually, under the influence of structural genes, be turned into a limb, be turned into a leg. What is it?
Is it the Hox genes?
It's more than Hox. It's OTC, OC. I'm blanking on the name of it. Okay, it's a specific, it's like an outgrowth gene. But those genes at that level, like if those genes are shared by insects and are responsible for producing an outgrowth in insects, and are also shared by, say, birds and are responsible for, at least in part, producing an outgrowth in birds to produce a limb that eventually goes on to make a wing, then at the level of the genes, wings in insects and birds are homologous at that deep level, and there is some degree of bias developmentally that's going on there, even if the eventual anatomical function of a wing is entirely convergent. And so it all comes back to this massive shade of gray in how you slice this. And that's why one of the other parts of the book, which I thought was a bit lacking, was just a strong emphasis on tree thinking, where you need a phylogeny, you need to diagnose all these traits, where they fall out, to speak to that shade of gray as it exists if we are to diagnose some version of convergence versus parallelism before we even get into the underlying mechanisms that might predispose or not the evolutionary outcomes that we see.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Right.
So with that in mind, I think that's a good discussion of the deeper points about the way the book is framed as these kind of competing ideas about how repeatable is evolution or how predictable is evolution. And much of the bulk of the book is getting into examples, and he tends to kind of structure it as observed examples, natural experiments, if you will, so island populations. And then we kind of get a little bit into large-scale field experiments, and then he kind of moves into the laboratory where you can manipulate microbial populations in order to ask some of these questions on a shorter time scale. So instead of kind of going through every example, I thought what I would do is just ask people, the panel of people here, did you have something that jumped out at you as being something you were particularly interested in when it was presented in the book, like an experiment that you hadn't heard of or one that really struck you in particular?
I'm happy to not talk. So
Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go first.
Go ahead.
Sunita, go ahead.
All right, okay. So many things here were new to me. I had not read about them. And so some of the things that really jumped out at me were, for example, where they were introducing new, not really new species, but species that were not finding that niche in some, I think it was in Trinidad, when scientists were doing that kind of experiments in the wild. I think he did make that point that, you know, you might think that this is kind of unethical, but it's really not because of blah, blah, blah. But it was really, I was not very comfortable with that idea, and I did not know that, you know, this is done. But I do think that it is, like, I was not very comfortable with that idea of, you know, tampering or tinkering with those.
Is this with the guppies? Is this the guppy experiment?
Yes, it is with the guppies one. Yeah, that was one thing. And the second thing that I was thinking about was not directly related to the theme of the book, but I was also thinking about the ethics of data sharing. We talk a lot about open science these days, but when data is collected at enormous expense in terms of money as well as, you know, personal effort, then there is a dimension to the ethics of data sharing that we have to probably consider when we talk about these things. So that's something that I, not directly related to the theme of the book, but I was thinking about these parallel things when I was reading the book.
Yeah, it's true. A lot of those large-scale ecological experiments are going to generate a huge data set. And then the question of how do you make that accessible to people? When should that be accessible to people? That's certainly a question people are contending with now. Other folks? So I think Sunita was talking about the guppy experiment, where you could take guppies and put them in different pools and see how they. I mean, when I read that, I thought, this is a massive undertaking. We're just going to do this. I'm used to just being able to grow stuff in the flask in the lab. I'm happy about being able to do that. Did other people? What jumped out at you guys in terms of the examples that he was calling on?
Well,
go for it. No, go for it, Mike. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Bryan. Yeah, I had heard about I had read some, and I'd even read a couple of the papers from Rainey on the Pseudomonas fluorescens, the fuzzy spreaders, and the wrinkly spreaders. But to be honest, I didn't realize how repeatable it was. So that's really struck me as interesting. And I'd be interested to hear if that example, if Bryan think that is that more appropriately called parallelism or versus convergence. But just the fact that you see that again and again and again just in a few weeks, that really struck me as interesting, and something that I thought it was. I knew it had been repeated before, but I just didn't realize that it was so consistently repeatable. So that really struck me.
Yeah, and I'll just make a little aside there, because in the course of the research that I do on predatory bacteria, there is a paper that came out where they did an experimental evolution study with Pseudomonas against Delivibrio, and the fuzzy spreader form of that Pseudomonas is apparently more resistant to predation by Delivibrio. So there's a lot going on with that study. There's a lot of things that I'm not sure are well explained. They didn't look at mechanism, although we know what genetic changes lead to the fuzzy spreader. But when I got to that part in the book, I was like, aha, here's that stuff. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting example. Nicole, did you have I know you said you didn't finish, but did you have something that jumped out at you?
Yeah, first of all, I had to get off the bus before I could read the fuzzy spreader business, so I'm looking forward to dealing with this when I have time. Which I feel so bad about. It's like it takes that long to get to the microbes and I can finish, but my time management has been garbage lately, so that's what's up with that. Fish transplants, I felt the same way about Sangita, because there was the response from the one scientist about how the perturbations of these populations are too minor to have a large-scale ecological effect. But I think as we're in a current socio-ecological political climate where I think we really need to be upfront about our unknown unknowns. So I mean, even with some of these large enclosure experiments, they're good. To what extent some of this can be used to inform conservation biology, I think means that we need to think in larger collaboratories and involving researchers from more vulnerable nations, geographical locations to prioritize what we do when we think about how an evolutionary ecology study might help us understand resilience and the extent to which we can and should intervene in the age of the Anthropocene. I mean, that's one of the big things that I think about is like, there are these ideas about we will engineer our ways into survival. And that's a very loaded, idea of thinking about our applied ecological study and even our evolutionary ecological study because of the differences in privilege in terms of who's caused the damage versus the ways we choose to fix them and the ways that we choose what we're not going to address. But also just this idea that like, these are field studies and they give us an idea of how things really happen when you've got more noise, but the full extent of what we can't control is always, it's not something we can ever touch or we can ever couch well when we come back and do the postmortem on that. And that's sort of just a general statement. We need to keep trying to unravel knowledge and to kind of try and figure out like, how much of this is the drive for modification that's produced by either environmental perturbation, selection, whatever. I really appreciated the fact, though, that he included the experiment to address the botanist that he antagonized so strongly about just sticking the different wood diameters in the box and like looking at how his lizards were physically conditioned, because he basically put them on a long-term training program as to this is what you're going to perch and walk on. And I really liked seeing that articulated, because I can also imagine that kind of effect, especially when you try to articulate potential ambiguities and misinterpretations to a non-science looking public, or to make that strong distinction between not really a habituation, but a conditioning effect versus a short-term evolutionary shift in a physiological or physical status. Those are things that are they're not nuanced when you think about what they actually mean because of where it came from mechanistically, but these are important aspects of misinterpreting what we see. And it actually made me think about an article I saw last year about a dental anthropologist who wrote about the fact that changing the consistency of foods in a diet in human populations or in small studies of humans actually changes dentition and like the emergence of teeth. And this is not evolutionary. It's more physical condition of jawbone density based on diets. So these ideas that, you can actually produce some very interesting sort of physical configurations just because of what you've given somebody to develop the pieces of themselves on. This is not deep genetic change. And I think it was good for him to kind of show that, number one, the discourse of science as it plays out in this pseudo-autobiographical book, involves addressing these kinds of concerns, which is why I think this book is so great to bring chapters like that to undergrads who are learning about what the process and what the interactions between different fields and what the peer review looks like, but also this is a very hard idea to communicate well, and it took him several pages to do it. So how you do it with concision and clarity, I don't know. I'm not that good at it. It was good to see it, though, in this narrative.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, I think. And I think that these are concepts that, to your point about undergraduate teaching, these are concepts, you have a lot of ground to cover when you're trying to introduce this content to undergraduates. You need them to think about population. You need them to think about numbers. You need them to think about timescales. You need them to think about plasticity in the example that you're talking about. You need them to think about lots of stuff that I think a lot of people would say that maybe all of this just started to coalesce for them when they had a couple of years to really chew on it in grad school. And a lot of people might tell you that it's still coalescing for them now as they kind of intersect with different aspects of it in their research. And I mean, I always like these books because I am an undergraduate educator, and I think that's the audience that a lot of these books, that's the sweet spot for a lot of these books, where they're aiming at somebody with a relatively solid science background, and then you're trying to take them a little bit beyond into concepts that are a bit new. And how you parcel that out, and how much are you going to try to tell them, and when do you get into the here's a wrinkle, here's a wrinkle, here's a wrinkle, or how much of that do you just kind of leave it? But yeah, I think it's a good launching point for sure for undergraduate classes. Luke, did you have an example you wanted to bring in?
Yeah, so I agree with the other people who talked about the guppy experiment, and I was a little uncomfortable with that one as well. But I also, it's not an experiment, but I liked the example that he said on page 271, where he was discussing genetically different populations of an organism experiencing the same selective pressures and how they would evolve differently. And so he talks about the greyhounds and the schnauzers on an island that a tiger is introduced to, and how for the greyhounds they would likely grow longer legs to outrun the tiger, but the schnauzers might develop cryptic coloring or something another way to avoid predation. I just thought that was kind of a nice way to explain that concept. Again, thinking of undergrads and people who aren't super familiar with a lot of these concepts.
Yeah, that is a good example, because lots of students have dogs, or so you could, and that is. Dog breeds are a really interesting example of evolution just in and of themselves, because you're dealing with an extraordinary amount of phenotypic variation. And you can talk a lot about, well, how would you get this way? And you've got the influence of domestic selection and breeds and very strict selection being applied. But then that's a good way to bring that into talking about what would happen if you let them loose on an island and they had this major predator. Like, how would they adapt differently given the material you have to start with? Bryan, I don't know, it sounds like you're familiar with quite a few of some of the work that's been discussed here. Was there anything in the book that was new to you?
Nothing fundamentally new, but how about this? How about we turn this around and pose it as a question for everyone here? And that is, there was a lot of emphasis on experimental evolution and studying evolution over what are properly dubbed ecological timescales, so hundreds to thousands of years, if not less, and then clearly human timescales included in that. And so, given the emphasis on experimental evolution, studies therein, results therefrom, are John Losos and Steve Gould speaking past each other in a way, given that Gould is very much a paleontologist, thinks about, or thought historically, about everything through a lens of geological time in contrast to ecological time. And even though we might find certain repeated outcomes manifest via a variety of mechanisms, whether there's, again, developmental bias involved heavily or not so much, is an issue of scale, geologically versus ecologically, a key point whereby the two authors might have been speaking past one another.
I'll just, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think that's a great question. And it actually, the reason I jumped in on this was because I was like, oh, yay. So this gives me an opening to talk about, he briefly discusses, where is it? All the extraordinary, and this kind of connects back to the very first book club discussion that we did for the Summer of Evolution, which was Life on a Young Planet.
Oh, by any knowledge.
Which looked at early evolution, so looking at early life, looking at single-celled organisms, kind of moving from bacteria into your first single-celled eukaryotes. And I don't know why I can't, I'm looking for the picture as my little point of reference about all of the weird, bizarre creatures that, here we go. So this, which was a great illustration.
Oh, right.
He does talk very, and in reference, in exactly what you're saying, in acknowledgement of the fact that Gould was thinking about life on a really broad timescale. He does spend one of the beginning chapters kind of talking a little bit about that, but then he goes past it. And I think the point that you're raising is a really good one, because I think you're right. I think, Gould is thinking on really large geological timescales where, and this is discussed, I think, briefly in the book here, where if you go back to these time periods, you've got this figure depicting these kind of bizarre creatures is from, 511 million years ago. But if you go even farther back, one of the things that we're not seeing is, what was the role of chance in which lineages made it out of these different time periods. So if you go all the way that far back and you start over and the lineage that we're all kind of dependent upon gets squashed and you've got something else, is everybody like a sentient pine cone? What happens then? And I think that, I think you're right. I think we're talking at two different scales. I'm really glad you made that point because I was thinking along those lines too. I don't know if other folks want to jump in on this as well.
Just to supplement one thought on that though, to let's say add to and accentuate the point that you just made. One way that Gould had classically thought about the world was actually captured a bit in that draft of thoughts that I had emailed to you. And that is on this concept of extrapolationism, wherein is it reasonable to say that you can study evolution over the short term, simply add time, and expect that those microevolutionary processes plus time are going to explain the full panoply of life's diversity? And his pretty comfortable answer to that question is no, and that extrapolationism fails, as he would say. And one of the reasons why he would say that is just given the hindsight of the past. I mean, as a paleontologist, he knows that particularly mass extinctions, they radically restructure ecosystems, they create opportunities for new lineages, and shuffle around the guilds, like these ecological groups, and the relative proportions that these ecological groups play in the environments that are either destroyed or created, given kind of this restructuring of ecosystems under the influence of mass extinction events. So in that way, I think with Wonderful Life, there was a lot of that kind of thinking that existed at the core of Gould's thesis in that book, that I think, again, is just kind of like a bit of this when it comes to Wonderful Life versus Improbable Destinies. Though the other side of that, I mean, fairly just knowing Gould's work reasonably well is, I could go through and basically kind of channeling a bit of that thinking, as in, so for example, just to like, you asked me about my background a bit a while ago. So like, I was never fortunate enough to know Steve Gould personally, but about 3 or 4 of my close mentors and graduate advisors were colleagues with him or peers. And so like vicariously, it almost feels weird to say Stephen J. Gould as opposed to just Steve Gould. It's like, if you and I got close and you were telling me about like some partner of yours and you were only making reference to them by first name, after so long, I'd be inclined just to, you know, if I'm speaking with somebody else, just call them by the first name that I was hearing from you. So for me, it's always just now become like Steve at that level, even though I never knew him personally. But with that said, like being comfortable, or at least learning enough about his contributions and his ideas, even putting the point about extrapolationism to the side, wherein I think, again, John Losos and Steve Gould had kind of missed a bit. Many of the counters to so many of the points in Improbable Destinies, I think Gould would come back with, fundamentally return to some of the leading talking points that we started with, which are these points about mechanism, because so much of Gould's career was focused on, let's broadly say, trying to dethrone natural selection as an all-powerful entity, as a cause for all things evolutionary. And so if you're going to say, as John Losos put it, and actually here, let me just kind of close out a full screen and pull up this quote that I had, which was perhaps a little rhetorical, and I don't know what page this was on because I did the audiobook, so I listened to it twice and I multitasked. But the quote, which seems like his thesis, but also kind of quasi rhetorical point, but no less, the thesis seemingly being in this book is convergence, a pervasive demonstration of the predictable forces of natural selection toward outcomes predestined by the environment. Or are examples of convergence the exception, cherry-picked illustrations of biological predictability in a haphazard world in which most species have no evolutionary parallel? And so the point is convergence a pervasive demonstration of the predictable forces of natural selection. If you're going to emphasize those predictable forces of natural selection, Gould would come back with, well, wait a second, if we emphasize mechanism, then if there's developmental bias, if there's phylogenetic constraint, meaning like you can only modify what you inherit, all those kinds of things, that detracts from the external ecological world that is like the world of natural selection, treating variation as like silly putty. That is, in a way, history and the developmental programs that organisms inherit from that history, they're not like silly putty. They're more like kind of polyhedrons of some sort that push back against the pool cue of selection, which is why you get sometimes these repeated evolutionary outcomes, not necessarily because natural selection is all powerful, but because you have bias of some sort or another predisposing those kinds of outcomes. So no less, I think that would have been Gould's counter to a lot of the repeatability claims in Improbable Destinies, but still, I think, given the historical focus on mass extinctions and what it means to be a mass extinction, there was a bit of kind of hit and miss with Wonderful Life and Improbable Destinies.
Yeah, I think that's a good point there. So I'm conscious of time. I don't want to keep people beyond the hour. So what I'd like to do is just ask for folks do you want to have some closing thoughts? Is there a topic we didn't really touch on that you'd like to comment on? And this would be a perfect time to kind of give us your closing thoughts on the book. I'll pick on Nicole since she's right next to me. So I'm just going to check to see if anybody has any closing thoughts. Nicole?
Okay, so first of all, I really appreciate everything that Bryan said, because that was such an articulate kind of discussion of the two sides of the mechanism and where the arguments maybe they should be meeting in the middle, but they don't. I think everything that he said kind of reminded me of a couple of things I've seen on my science Twitter feed from the soil side, which is there's a couple papers where people are trying to infer the abundance or the extent to which you've got dormant microbes in soil all the time. And we do know that there's sort of these periods of quiescence and activity. And I mean, when you look at the soil biology literature, the nap of quiet desperation where you're kind of hanging out, not doing too much until the food shows up, that's a thing. That's their life. So, but I mean, that's not our lives. We eat, and when we starve, we we've got troubles. I mean, we have organs that are obligatory glucose users. So like we can't.
I feel like I would welcome a nap of quiet desperation.
Yeah, exactly. Or just a nap. I think we just want naps. No connotations of desperation. I feel you on that. So what does that mean for the playbook of the temporal component when you're napping because you're starving? Because that's embedded discontinuity in being awake, in dividing your DNA, in having mutational events, or having lags, in relation to environmental interpretation. So like the playbook of the temporal part is something that, again, it's really just as humans trying to figure this stuff out. So we're always going to get it wrong. We're always going to pick systems where mathematical inferential stuff is going to get us so far. It's eventually destined to fail. But the reason I love thinking about this with respect to microbes is because they do this dormant and then active thing. So we can't talk about a life history from birth to death. I mean, there are probably some things in paleomats that aren't dead yet, but they've just been asleep for a really long time. So those are systems where we can't even begin to think about susceptibility to an environmental selection effect, because it might just be that you wake up at the right time. And the other thing with the protein aspect, which is sort of the easy playbook, it's like, what part of my innards changed to make this biochemistry happen or give me this new pathway? We always see the big consequences. We don't see the genetic or protein scaffolds that are in the nightclub, but they haven't made it to VIP status because they're not doing something essential. Maybe they're undergoing flux, but they haven't come into their own where they've shown how they are facilitating survival yet. So we're not seeing all the waiting line sequelae of genetic shift. And that's a big part that's missing, and we have to acknowledge that in a lot of cases we can't. Whole genome sequencing will actually let us know what full landscapes of that look like if you develop an ambitious enough experiment like LTEE. But those are properties that emerge, and we'll just have to figure it out in terms of good old fashioned looking at physiology in whatever system. So I think the ideas are all there. I think they were talking past each other because there's the points of time, there's the points of environmental perturbation interacting with time, and there's the points of the stuff that's changing, that's probably going to be important at some point, but it's latent. It's like an asymptomatic agent of change, so to speak. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, and Nicole, I appreciate your perspective on this because it's kind of a biochemical protein-based, you're bringing a lot of that side of things into it. And I think that's an important to think about it in that way too. Mike, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think I can summarize 3 main points that I've come in thinking of. One, I agree with what Bryan and Nicole and everyone's been saying about that question. I think they are, to a large extent, speaking past each other. And I think that's mostly a result of Losos's, his experimental, his career, his work. He's not a paleontologist. So maybe we need a book like this that's written by paleontologists or a collaboration of paleontologists and microbiologists. I don't know, but he does. I feel like he asks this question. He sets up the book in the main questions about convergence, and then he goes through all his examples, and he does try to apply that to the big long-term question, more like Gould was saying, with replaying long-term macroevolutionary trends. And I think he struggles, and it comes kind of to the point where we see. With different scales, and we see these different patterns of convergence in these experimental, or parallelism in these experimental systems. But that, you really need to take his expertise in these field and lab experiments at different scales and add to that the patterns that paleontologists might see, and spine lengths on trilobites and snail shells and stuff like Gould has done. So maybe we need a meso. We got microevolutionary sort of processes. We think of macroevolutionary. Maybe some scales of mesoevolutionary processes will eventually come about. And I think the other thing, I'm slightly biased, but I think more natural examples of things like the fuzzy spreader, wrinkly spreader systems will come out in natural systems like wastewater treatment plants. You see a very similar group of the main organisms if you look at aerobic digesters all across the world. And I think you probably will find some interesting examples of parallel evolution in those systems as well. But I also think his examples, even if he's kind of talking past Gould's points, are good. I think it's a really good book, again, for the undergraduates and general public, just talking about some of the challenges in evolutionary biology and what we do and don't know. And because I come from, growing up in a very fundamentalist religious background, I wasn't really sure about evolution at all until I got to college, working my biology degree. So I appreciate the fact that he brings out this great diversity of examples and shows for non-biologists, I think it can really open people's eyes to what evolution is on these scales, and how, we do have good examples, good mechanisms, and we know a lot in terms of genetics and biochemistry and recent phylogenetic parallelisms or convergence. And yes, there's still a lot of huge questions about large trends, but some of the really big ideas like evolution itself, common ancestry, and so on, are not really in doubt. And I think that's an important message to get across to people every generation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a really good point. The notion of continuing to provide people with the wealth of evidence that we have for evolutionary theory in general is always a noble and important goal. Because I think, as you mentioned, I think every generation we have people who don't get exposed to this until some later point of their educational career. And it's good to have accessible resources for them to, when they have questions, kind of start to see, here's why we can make these arguments. Here's our supporting evidence. That's a great point. Luke, do you have any closing thoughts?
I don't have anything else to add about the book, but I just want to thank you for organizing the whole summer book club. I didn't make it for the other ones, but I read all the books and I really enjoyed them. So thanks for putting them on my radar. And yeah, it was nice hearing everybody's thoughts about this one.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to you for joining us. I really do appreciate that. It's not much of a discussion if it's just me. I wouldn't want to just discuss with myself. Bryan, do you have any closing thoughts?
Sure. So how about one question, which I won't answer. I will leave that as an outstanding question as a closing thought, and then just one brief statement. And the question is, did any of the examples that were provided actually document macroevolution? And then the closing thought is a recent book, as in a few years ago, by Robert Asher, a mammalian paleontologist at Cambridge. He published called Evolution and Belief, Confessions of a Religious Paleontologist. I was asked to review that for the National Center for Science Education. And I would say the general take home for that book is, I would say, about equivalent to the general take home for this book, which is both authors did an excellent job documenting a synthetic case for evidence as it underpins what we understand about how evolution works. But I think also both authors did not succeed as well as they could have in packaging that evidence in a way that perhaps does justice to the history and structure of evolutionary thinking. I think that's about it.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, evidence is great, but the packaging I thought could have been a little more strategic.
That's true. That is an important part of it as well. So for my part, I really enjoyed this book, and I think the best praise that I could give this book is that it took me longer than I expected to get through it, because I would read stuff and then stop and think about how it was applicable to my own work. And so that kind of delayed me a little bit getting through things, because I would sit down to start to read, and then I'd go, oh man, what if we could do this or that in our system? And I would kind of wander off and go write ideas down, and then I'd be like, no, I'm supposed to read the book. And I honestly think that's probably the best praise you could give a book like this, is that it was not only an excellent kind of walkthrough of some of these ideas, although we have pointed out places that we think it might have done a little bit more. But it definitely gave me some new directions and some inspiration to think about things that we're doing in our own research, which is always a wonderful thing. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for being here today. I really appreciate everybody working with the schedule to be able to be here. It was a little bit of a chaos to get it scheduled, but I'm glad it worked out. So thanks to everybody. And so this is going to finish our summer book club. We read 3 excellent books. If you would like to see any of those discussions, you can go to our website, which is g+microjc.wordpress.com. We've got the records for the 3 books that we read, plus links, I think, to the YouTube channel. And you can also see the books that we've read. This is our 4th time doing this. So you can see the books that we've read for our other summer book clubs as well. So with that, I'll close out the broadcast, and thanks everybody for being here.
Okay, thank you very much.